Mr. William Wells. Yours.
I'm not sure how the timetable works, but we should give people a moment to move around. I think I will start very quickly. So, as some of you may know, Rothschilds have an exclusive association with Porter, and we have a level of activity in this part of the world. And as somebody was saying in the previous presentation, a question from the floor, culture seems to be a very important theme of today's presentations. And Melanie Aspey, who is the archivist of Rothschilds, and much more than that, is sort of the keeper of the Rothschilds' cultural flame. And over the years, on many occasions, we have had visitors and clients in our offices in London who don't remember the extensive analysis and brilliant insight that we as investment bankers bring to their business. They remember going to see Melanie after the meeting and hearing some extraordinary bits of information about how 100, 200 years ago Rothschilds was doing this, that and the other. So whatever you thought was a brilliant new idea, actually we were thinking about 200 years ago, and not necessarily too many things have changed. They don't remember people like me, but they always remember Melanie. So, Melanie, have a similar impact on the audience here.
Thank you very much, William. Not to be set up for a fall, but thank you very much indeed, William, for the words of introduction. I learned a little bit about Lithuania before I came here, and that is that it's the centre of Europe. I also happen to live just a few hundred metres from zero longitude in Greenwich, in London, from the Greenwich Meridian. So I actually already feel that I've begun to move east even before I left home. But I really appreciate the compliment of being invited to talk about what really is my favourite subject, the Rothschild Archive and the history of the Rothschild family. I'm an archivist, and I love history. I hope that you all like history too, and that if you don't at the moment, in the next 30 minutes or so, you'll feel a little bit differently about it. But my job as an archivist is actually to record the words of other people, the people who worked in our business in this instance. At the moment, not in a virtual way, but we will be moving towards that direction in due course. Most of what I look after is actually paper. And I record the words of 5 people who were born in Frankfurt in the 18th century. 5 boys who established themselves in businesses around Europe. And there are many, many people in the world today named Rothschild, but the ones that I'm interested in are the descendants through the male line of the 5 men: Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Carl and James. I wanted to start too with a couple of quotations, the words of other people. And my first one is a quotation of Charlotte de Rothschild in 1848, at a time of incredible revolutions in Europe. And she said, "It cannot be all pleasant in these tumultuous times, but it will never do to give up hope of a brighter European and a Rothschild future." And I'll pair that with another quotation. Let's see if we've got the right one so far. Oh, that's not going to move. I'll pair that with another one from the beginning of the 21st century. And these are the words of our vice chairman of Rothschild. "We must have got something right some of the time. According to the theory, we shouldn't be here." Now, he said those words in 2007, just before the financial crisis, and let it be seen that actually we are still here. Rothschild as a business is still around. So, as he says, we must have been doing something right some of the time. The 2 images that you would have seen had the slide been working, are pictures of the business in London. The second New Court building, our address is New Court in London, and the fourth New Court building. And I think it says a lot to clients, as William says, that if people come to visit Rothschild, they actually come to the archive, but they come to the site of the formation of the business. So there's a really strong message to be taken, I think, from the fact that we still have the same address. In a rather megalomaniac way, in my image, I chopped off the image of the bank and shown solely the image of the archive, which is directly opposite the main entrance. But for the sake of history, let's start at the beginning, which for us is Frankfurt am Main. And in Frankfurt am Main, in 1744, a man called M.Aspey Rothschild was born into the Jewish ghetto. He lived there, he dealt in coins and medals and British textiles in particular, and he brought up his 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters. Part of his trade, a major part of his trade, was dealing in antique coins and medals to a rather refined, specific group of people, many members of princely families. And one of his major clients was the Elector of Hesse Castle, who was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. His clients trusted him. They came back to him time and time again because they knew that they were getting a good deal from Aspey. He actually printed a catalogue of his coins so that people would know what the prices were, and they knew that he would be charging that price to everyone else. The Elector played a major role in the Rothschild business. And the business philosophy that Aspey had established at that time was remembered by his sons in later life, in particular by his second son, Salomon, who talked to his brothers about the message that their father had given them. He said, "Let us be satisfied with a little less, dear brothers, if we can thereby remain in the saddle." So you didn't want to suddenly make a huge amount of money out of one client and lose that client who would go and find other advisors. You wanted to make sure that the client stayed with you, that he kept with you for as long as the relationship was good for both parties. The trust element was a hugely important aspect of that relationship. And what Salomon said was actually echoed in a similar way by the previous chairman of the Rothschild Bank in London, who retired in 2003, Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, when he was asked about the secret of the business's success. He said, "Our fundamental philosophy is relationship banking. We have a long-term commitment to our clients. And so you can see that short-term was never really part of the Rothschild idea." The next person to tell you about, apart from Aspey, actually is the third of his sons, who's Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who came to London in 1798. He was not one of the signatories to a very important document that we have in the archive, a partnership agreement. The partnership agreement was brought together by Aspey Rothschild and his sons in 1810. In 1810, Aspey realised that the good name that he'd built up for himself as a sole trader would die with him, and he wanted that name to survive him. He realised that forming a partnership, a sort of corporate body that would hold the good name, or I suppose the brand we might call it these days, he realised that that would continue after his death with his sons, and he encouraged them to sign with him. But his third son, Nathan, was already in Britain, acting as a textile merchant, and he wasn't able to sign it. But his sons actually continued to do what he'd asked them to do in the terms of this partnership agreement. There are 4 main elements to it. The first is that he wanted his sons to work together. He wanted them to work in the partnership. He wanted them to share profits so that they were supporting each other in difficult times. He wanted them to bring their sons into the partnership agreement in successive generations. And the fourth, rather distressing element is that he didn't want his daughters, his 5 daughters, to play any role in the management of the business. He said they could work as cashiers and bookkeepers, but they were not to have any role in the development of the business itself. Now, I'll talk about the women a little later on, because they had a really important role in how things developed. Nathan Mayer came to London and really took the business onto another level. because he was able to help his father's client, the Elector of Hesse, to invest his assets in London when the Elector's property and his territory had been invaded by Napoleon. The Elector had to go into exile, but he trusted M.Aspey to look after his assets for him. And Nathan Rothschild in London was continuing that work. And thereby, he became quite a big player, a serious player in the markets. He brought himself and his family to the attention of the British government, who needed someone to help them, needed an agent to help them, to buy up coin and to remint it into a form that could be sent to the Duke of Wellington on campaign with Britain's allies against Napoleon. The British government had tried to do this itself, and it had also tried to have other agents do this work for it. But every time they had done this in the past, they tried to buy up too much from too few dealers, and everybody knew that the ultimate client was the British government, and the dealers put up their prices. But Nathan Rothschild and his family, his brothers, his cousins and his brothers-in-law, were able to buy up small amounts of coin from lots and lots of different dealers across Europe. And nobody realised that the ultimate client was the British government. The market stayed flat, the government was terribly happy, and the Rothschilds took on the risk themselves of shipping the coin across the channel to provide the coin in the right currency so that the Duke of Wellington could pay his troops. It was a tremendous success, a real coup. And actually, one of the things that Nathan Rothschild said at that time about how do you be successful in business, what are the secrets of success? And he said, it requires a great deal of boldness and a great deal of caution to make a great fortune. And when you have got it, it requires 10 times as much wit to keep it. So he's very aware of this need for caution. As you will see, this is a tradition that's passed down in the Rothschild business. He was caricatured in 1817, Nathan Rothschild, showing him with rather a sort of substantial paunch. He managed to establish himself in London, very near to the Bank of England and the Royal Exchange. So I think something like the running events that we're having this afternoon would be completely alien to him. But his brothers said this was great that he was caricatured. It meant that he was famous and that people knew him and people would be drawn to him because he was a figure of some success. He actually, with his brothers, became advisors then to the Austrian Chancellor Metternich after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. And thanks to Metternich and thanks to the Austrian Emperor, the Rothschild brothers became barons of the Austrian Empire in 1822. And they were awarded a rather splendid coat of arms. The coat of arms featured a symbol of themselves. They went to a huge amount of effort to think about the kind of symbol that stood for them and their values. And they remembered at this time a story that their father had told them about how easy it was to break one arrow. You could snap an arrow very easily over your knee. But if you have a bundle of 5 arrows, they're much stronger. You can't break them. And that was the image that they had in their mind when they chose the symbol of the 5 arrows to represent them. Together, they were much more strong than they would be individually. And they also thought, they went to a great amount of effort to design the coat of arms. They also thought that if you were going to have a coat of arms, you had to put in a bit of Latin as well. That was just really the whole thing. And they chose 3 Latin words: concordia, integritas, industria. Harmony, integrity, hard work. And those 3 words have really infused the Rothschild business over the last 200 or so years. Nathan was very good at giving advice. He gave advice to young men who asked him how they could become as successful as he had. And he said to one person in the 1830s, what you should do, you should stick to one business. Stick to your brewery. He was talking to the son of a brewer. Stick to your brewery and you may be the great brewer of London. Be a brewer and a banker and a manufacturer and a merchant, and you will soon end up in the Gazette. That's to say, it would be the newspaper that advertised the fact that you'd gone bankrupt. Your businesses were over. Because even though the Rothschild family businesses have diversified, They've never given less than 100% to the business. And Nathan's advice, I think, was not to be half-hearted. If you were going to enter into business, have the passion for it and really give your all to the development of the business. So he diversified, and he took his advice from a very special person, from his wife. This is where the ladies begin to come into it, they begin to get a look in. Hannah Rothschild, who was born Hannah Cohen, from a family of very significant Jewish merchants in London. They were rather more sophisticated than was Nathan, who described himself as an offhand man. He had really nothing to lose. He was able to take risk when he began his business. But with his wife, he realised that he had to prepare for the next generation. He had not had a very deep or long-lasting education, but he realised that his sons and his daughters needed to be educated to take their role in society. And he relied on Hannah, on his wife, to take control of the education of the children. But Hannah was much more sophisticated in other ways. She was a very politically astute woman, and she was a very good letter writer, a campaigner. And the image that you would have seen was of a pair of Nathan and Hannah together, where Hannah is very clearly working side by side with her husband, choosing the right people to write to, helping him to write his letters. And we know from the archive that she actually signed cheques on his behalf. She bought on his behalf the first family estate. And she was also responsible, as were many of the women in the family, for networking, for meeting with women friends, explaining the Rothschild business to them, so that they would explain to their husbands, who might then take a participatory role in some of the Rothschild business ventures later on. Nathan Rothschild died too young, it has to be said. He was only 58, and he died rather unexpectedly in Frankfurt, his hometown. He names Hannah very specifically in his will. He makes her one of his executors. He tells his sons, who are in their 20s, that they are not to make a single decision in business unless they've spoken to their mother first. She's the one who will give them the best advice. But he doesn't break the terms of the partnership agreement. She's not to have control of the partnership agreement, she's not to have a control of the business, but he recognises the very powerful, influential role that she can have. His sons, Nathan's sons, continued his business and continued to develop the client base and the business throughout Europe, so that then by the 1840s, actually they have business houses or strong agency relationships across the world. And Nathan's son Lionel also played a very significant role in the political life of the UK. The family were always responsible for the community around them. They always took the decisions they made seriously because they felt that it would reflect well or badly on the Jewish community as a whole. So they were good neighbours. They were concerned with providing the kinds of institutions like schools and hospitals for the people around them in the cities that they established banks. And Lionel, Nathan's son, really took that step one further along the road when he campaigned to become the first Jewish Member of Parliament in the UK. And this is a very interesting point of political history for the UK too. He was first elected in 1847 as the Liberal representative of the City of London. Now we tend to think perhaps of the city as being rather an establishment, conservative institution. But the city elected Lionel, who couldn't take his seat when he was elected, because every new Member of Parliament had to take an oath to the sovereign, an oath of allegiance. And the oath contained the words, "On my word as a Christian." That would not have been binding on Lionel's conscience, so he couldn't take his seat. But the City of London returned him 5 more times in a series of elections between 1847 and 1858. And finally, in 1858, the words, "On my word as a Christian," were removed from the oath and Lionel could take his seat. And that meant that there was greater political equality in the country. And the Rothschilds have been able to do this because they built up such a good name for themselves as businessmen and as good citizens. And around about the same time, actually, in the very first year that Lionel was elected, one of his cousins, a man called Benjamin Davidson, travelled east, travelled this way from London with some gold. He was on his way to St. Petersburg, and in March 1847 he arrived in Riga in a bit of a state. He'd had a very, very difficult journey. He dropped the gold into the river at Cologne. He thinks he rescued most of it according to the letters that he left behind. But when he got to Riga, he finally wrote back to the house in London to say that he'd arrived, he was safe. The gold was in a bit of a bashed state, and at Tilsit he'd had to put the carriages onto sleds to get them through the mud. But he made it in the end to St. Petersburg. Mud was to play quite a large role in Benjamin Davidson's life because he wasn't able to establish a house in St. Petersburg permanently because he was Jewish. And ultimately he travelled on to San Francisco and became one of the 49ers at the time when gold was discovered there. Lionel's son, Nathaniel, Lionel was the first Jewish member of Parliament. Nathaniel, his son, became the first Jewish peer. And he, in many ways, exemplified one of Nathan's maxims about caution, the quality of caution being so important in business. He realised, as did many people in the city, that there was a great deal of money to be made from investments in natural resources. But in the 1880s, on the London Stock Exchange, a mine was defined as a hole in the ground owned by a lion. Now clearly there was something in some of these holes, there was some gold, there were some diamonds, but how would you work out what was a good prospect? And Nathaniel Rothschild realised the solution to this was to employ a good expert. And he put together in London a syndicate, a city syndicate called the Exploration Company. The Exploration Company employed the world's best mining engineer, an American called Hamilton Smith, who went out to examine these prospects. When there was a claim about gold or rubies or diamonds, he would go to investigate and then he would report back to the syndicate on whether or not it was going to be a good investment for them and for the investing public at large. And in fact, the word of the Exploration Company, backed by the Rothschild word, was a really good sign of something being as secure as it possibly could be as an investment. And in fact, when the Burma ruby mines were floated in London in the 1880s, there was such a queue of people trying to subscribe for the loan because it was backed by Rothschild, that Nathaniel couldn't get into his office for the whole day. And the lady and gentleman I met at lunch would like this very much, from an insurance company. Nathaniel was asked, as was his grandfather, for the secrets of success. And in terms of speculation, he thought about caution very much. He said, treat speculations as you would a cold bath. Plunge into them and jump out again very quickly. But he also exemplified caution in his role as chairman of the Alliance Assurance Company, a company that had been founded by his grandfather. In 1912, Nathaniel Rothschild, as chairman of the Alliance Assurance Company, was approached to insure the Titanic, and he declined on the grounds that it was too big to float. So caution really has a very important role to play, as you will understand, in business. The women of the family also were developing other interests by the middle of the 19th century. And by the middle of the 19th century too, actually the third generation of the family were beginning to break away from the business in some areas. My example here is going to be a young man called Ferdinand. Ferdinand played no role in the business. He was absolutely passionate about art and not about business. And I think if his grandfather Nathan had seen this passion that he had, he would have understood why he wanted to pursue it and not to pursue business. And the women, as well as some of the men, were developing interests in art. Hannah Rothschild had been this great source of advice, a font of advice for her family. But she and her sisters and cousins were also great hostesses. Ferdinand, my example, was somebody who explained in very clear terms the importance of these salons that the women had and the great art collections that they'd built up. He talked about collections of art that were private, one day coming into the public domain, and that they were important to have in houses, in your great houses, and to form art collections so that people of the world could meet from different branches of society, could meet in these environments and could discuss things. They could form networks, they could discuss the major issues of the day without being confined to their own business houses or their own political parties. And in many ways, events like this are typical of the kind of thing that the Rothschild family were doing in the 19th century, building a forum, forming an environment so that people can meet together. And in fact, the art collection that Ferdinand built up is still available for people to see today. So what he foresaw was that private collections coming into the public sector has very much been accomplished by the family. He made a very significant bequest, Ferdinand, to the British Museum. The contents of his smoking room, a fantastic collection of Renaissance art objects that he made to the British Museum in the late 19th century. And this is one of the significant, probably the largest single bequest that a British museum, any museum, has ever received. And at the moment it's looking even more glorious than ever. If you're in London visiting the British Museum, really, I encourage you to go and see this fantastic collection. The Rothschild Foundation, a family charity, has helped the British Museum to re-display this collection in a very, very fine way. And in fact, that same foundation is active in Vilnius too. I went to see some of the work that they're doing with digitisation of material from the Jewish community in Vilnius. And they're very, very much aware of the significance of that collection and trying to make it more available, not just within Vilnius and Lithuania, but to the world at large. Ferdinand, as I said, played no role in the business. His brother Albert was the person who took over the Austrian branch of the family, the Viennese house. And the two of them had similar tragedies in their lives. Ferdinand had married his cousin Evelina, who died in childbirth in 1866, and he was inconsolable. He actually went on a journey throughout Europe to arrived in St. Petersburg in the 1860s and 1867, trying to find some sort of consolation, I suppose, in art, in the great collections of Europe. But he lost his wife, he never remarried, he dedicated himself for the rest of his life to his collections. But he also wanted to do something in Evelina's memory, and he sought advice from his colleagues in London, who suggested that what was really needed in London was a hospital for children. And this was something that really resonated with him. He built entirely from his own funds a hospital called the Evelina. He named it after his wife. And that hospital had many members of the family on the board. Many of the women were involved in these activities. And in more recent years, the Evelina has re-established itself in London in its own premises. And the Rothschild family, members of the family, and Rothschild family foundations have re-equipped this hospital to a very large extent. Albert too, Ferdinand's brother, lost his wife. She was only 33 years old. She left 7 children behind her. And what Albert did was to create what was in fact the first women's hospital in the Austrian Empire. And it's still, part of it still exists. It's called after his wife. It's the Bettina. And these days it's a nurses' hostel, but it was a major hospital for women in the empire. So this idea of being a business but being a good neighbour as well, you can see is really continuing in the generations. In the 1920s, a man from another famous banking house, Sigmund Warburg, who became such a significant figure in the city from the 1960s, when he was a young man, he served an apprenticeship at Newcourt at the London Bank. And his thank you letter, which we found quite recently in the archive, is a wonderful example of the ethos, I think, of the bank at that time, and I feel too today. He said he learned an awful lot about business. He said he learned a lot about business machinery, but he learned something also which would be more important to him in his future life, and that is the fine tradition of Newcourt, which combines business with humanity without neglecting either. That was something he knew would be of great significance to him in his future life, his future career. And I'm going to show you 2 further examples of that consciousness, that awareness of life outside the bank. separated again by about 100 years. In 2012, a major British organisation called the Wildlife Trusts, which manages areas of special scientific interest in the country for birds, bees, flowers and so on. The Wildlife Trusts celebrated its centenary in 2012, and it owes its centenary, it owes its existence to a member of the Rothschild family called Charles Rothschild, who bought land in 1912 that could be preserved as a wildlife reservation. And Charles is considered to be the father of Nature Conservancy in the UK. From the bank, he was a banker most of the time, but he also developed a network of natural history societies, local natural history societies, which would help lobby the government to make sure that land was set aside and not overdeveloped. And a very young member of the family, in more recent years, David de Rothschild, also committed to the environment and to ecology questions, has brought attention to the huge problems of waste, of the disposal of litter, the effect that this is having on our oceans, by constructing a vessel made entirely out of plastic water bottles, on which he sailed from San Francisco to Australia. He called it the Plastiki, and he was trying to encourage children to think about what they can do for the environment as well. And neither of these activities has anything to do with the business at all. But I think the founders of the business would have recognised in their descendants that passion that they first had for business, a passion that has actually emerged in different areas. And so one last thing. Everybody's heard of Rothschild banks. Some of you have heard of Rothschild art collections. There are Rothschild gardens, Rothschild properties that you can visit. And maybe, just maybe, you've heard about Rothschild wine. I don't know, that's usually, yes, a few nods in the audience there. The current member of the family who is responsible for looking after Chateau Lafite in France has been commissioning for the last 40 years a wonderful collection of photographs of the vineyard. Each year the photographs form part of the New Year greeting card. A few years ago, he commissioned a man called Richard Avedon, famous fashion photographer, to produce a portfolio of photographs. And his portfolio was entirely of the workers at Lafite. It's a really tremendous gift to them, I think, and an appreciation from Baron Eric about the work that everybody does at Lafite, generations of families who've been working on the vineyard. And he says something rather wonderful about the vineyard. He says, Lafite has a soul, a beautiful, generous, kindly soul. Lafite turns bare earth into heaven. Lafite is harmony. Harmony, going back to the brothers' first thoughts about business. This harmony is between man and nature, because without our magnificent wine growers, nothing would be accomplished. That really has very little to do with business, I realise, and although I'm not an expert in either thing, in business or wine growing, it seems to me that both have something in common. You need to prepare the ground if you're going to be successful. You need expert people. You need good external conditions. You need endurance. And you also need to prepare for the very, very long term, perhaps for something that you are not going to live to enjoy, but which your descendants will live to enjoy. You're creating an inheritance for them. But since I'm talking in a business environment, I should end on one business note, and that is the words of our current chairman, David de Rothschild, who was asked about the secrets of success of the Rothschild business, and he said, "We believe in the merits of our model. It offers clients that which is most precious: confidence, experience, and ethics." And I think that would be recognised by all of the generations, going back 8 generations of the family, back to the ghetto in Frankfurt. And I hope that William's explained that we have an archive in London that we encourage people to visit. So if you're going to be visiting London, it would be very nice to see you in reality, because I couldn't show you the photograph of the archive, but it would be lovely to see you, and also delightful to be able to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie, for a very interesting presentation. Honestly, it's like listening to the historical novel.
Right.
And it's so amazing how enduring family business could be. Nations were rising and falling in 200-300 years, and here we're talking family business. 300 years, almost 300 years. Should be some secret message. It's a recipe that you are not revealing. But now I would like to open the floor for the discussion, for the questions. Any questions? Okay. This one.
My name is Shulmaskinos. I wonder if you could answer how historically accurate is the scene from Sharpe's Rifles, where the actual delivery, how the actual delivery of gold to the Duke of Wellington is made?
Not very. Two very brief words. In fact,
it's an inside joke. Only one man knows it.
It's really been interesting this year. This is the bicentenary of Battle of Waterloo. And one of the stories that we had always believed, the family and the business and historians had always believed, was that a pigeon brought the news of Waterloo back to Nathan at Newcourt, and he was the first to have received the news. One of our researchers, who had the bicentenary of Waterloo in mind a few years ago, actually did some research in the archives, and he realised that actually Rothschild was not the first person to hear about the news of the victory at Waterloo. It was Lord Percy. But there's a much more complicated backstory about how that rumour began in the 19th century. But it's good to do research properly.
More questions? Actually, I have one. What is your favourite Rothschild character?
My favourite Rothschild. I'm very fond of Hannah Rothschild, I have to say, because she wasn't afraid of the world. She was, when you think about women in the 19th century perhaps having no role in society except sitting at home and receiving people for tea, she was somebody who recognised within the confines of the opportunities available to her, she really did recognise that she could do something, and she did. She went for it. I like Hannah very much.
Your answer actually brings me to my second question. I've heard from the presentation that the role of the Rothschild family women was quite limited. Now we live in the 21st century. Are those rules also enduring? Do the women have any role in the Rothschild family these days? What those roles
and what the roles might be. I refer to that partnership agreement, which specifically excluded the girls from taking a role in the business. The partnership agreement itself, as a legal document, had force within the business for about a century. And it's interesting when you talk about long-term business, I say about a century in a very casual way, but the philosophies are still enduring, but the legal terms are not. It's just no longer enforceable. But I can answer your question using the words of somebody else again, David de Rothschild, our chairman, when he's been asked this is the 21st century, what about the women? He's always said, well, the girls were always so much more intelligent than the boys. We were afraid of them. But actually, really, it wasn't the girls they were afraid of, it was their husbands. So had the business actually come into the hands of the girls, there would have been an issue about sons-in-law and brothers-in-law having a role in the business. And I think in more recent years, perhaps some of the women have felt free of the responsibility of not having to come into the business. And we have Emma Rothschild, who's an economic history professor at Harvard University, Hannah Rothschild, another Hannah Rothschild, who's the chairman of the National Gallery now, and members of the family who work in the business too.
And more questions? If no, I would like to thank Melanie for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry that we were